One of the first things that I learned in the classes I was taking for Scripture is that we always needed to be interested and concerned about the context out of which the Scriptures arise. The old belief was that God whispered everything that God wanted into the writer's ear. And so what's in the Bible is exactly how God wanted it to be. But what we've learned over the past 100+ years of biblical studies is that while we still might hold to the idea of divine revelation and inspiration in the Scripture, that they have come out of a historical moment in time from people who lived in a very particular cultural, economic, political, social world. And that the writers were not writing, or God wasn't intending for the writer to speak to us in 2016, but rather that the first audience for the Scripture were the very people in the first century. And, of course, if you go back into the Hebrew Scriptures, centuries before. They were the first audience. So anything in the Scripture that we read today had to make sense for them in the first century. If it wasn't going to make sense, then it wouldn't have been written down. Otherwise, people would just kind of shrug their shoulders and not pay too much attention at all to what the Scripture or the sacred writings were about. And so I learned that context, the historical context, the cultural context, even the political context and the social context were all very important things that we needed to know something about. Over time, we've gotten more information because of archaeology, because of the readings that we've done in other writings contemporary to the Scriptures. The excavations have helped us to understand all of these things much, much better. So having said that, if we consider for a moment for these Scriptures and what happens in the lectionary, that as we come to the end of the church year, last week a little bit, this week even more so, and next week, that the liturgical season is focused on endings, because the church year is ending, and the first Sunday of Advent at the end of November will begin a new church year. And so when you think about beginnings and endings, they kind of clash up against each other. Every ending is a beginning, and every beginning, in a sense, unleashes an ending. So that's kind of the overall view of the lectionary and why we have the Scriptures today. But having said that, going back, that if we consider the followers of Jesus found themselves as Jews inspired and lifted up by his prophetic character of teaching, that he restored for them a vision of God and God's actions in the world, that he told them that God was indeed about compassion and mercy, that God was interested in justice, especially for the poor. But it wasn't just words that he spoke, it was actions and deeds. We know that. We've been following all of that through this year of Luke, seeing how in Jesus preaching and proclaiming that the reign of God was at hand, that he didn't just make it about spiritual realities, but hardcore physical realities. And we know that that's what the invitation was always. Come in and share this renewed vision of God. It wasn't a new vision, it was a renewed vision of God, where God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. That God in this vein was to be the motivator for all the community, especially Jesus' followers, the Jewish community, to practice the same. The problem was, right, you hear it next week, that he dies, that he wasn't able to continue to lead the community to a renewal within Judaism, in a sense. And for many it seemed that indeed that the death of Jesus ended that vision. How can you keep believing when the very one that you put your hope and your trust in doesn't make it to the end of the story, so to speak? And so the invitation ran up against a brick wall. While there are stories, and we'll have to wait all the way till next Easter to get the stories again of resurrection, that I'm sure that as they sat at that empty tomb, They must have become very despondent. But they had one thing. They had the relationships that they had created as a result of them following Jesus. But it was more than just a relationship. It was the way that they understood that they were to be community for each other. Not individually for themselves, but how they were to be community for each other. And in being community for each other, that meant that they, as they listened anything to Jesus, that they had to do exactly what he did. And so even though Jesus was no longer going to be with them, they had his actions to follow. The memory of his way that he reached out to the lepers and touched the lowly and spoke to the poor and held everyone with dignity and respect, from women on down to children, that they had that, and that's what they shaped and formed their community around, were the actions and the words of Jesus. And they lived not in the empty tomb, but rather they lived in the Spirit of Jesus, or as they would experience, the Spirit of the resurrected Jesus. And one more thing that they had that we'll do this morning. They had their fellowship, their table fellowship together. Now they understood that it wasn't just feeding their stomachs that they did when they sat at table, but now it was feeding not only their individual spirit, but feeding the life of the community. Because when you gather around a table to share in a common meal, that it's not, the sense of that is that no one goes away hungry, either spiritually, physically, whatever it might be. And so they had not only their relationships with each other, but they also had the understanding that as a community they were to live out the actions and words of Jesus, and they could come to the table, as we will do in a few moments, to celebrate the memory of Jesus. And that's what enabled them to make it through, was a memory filled with all of that joy and that hope and experiences for themselves, because many of the company of Jesus were people who had been healed and touched and made whole and lifted up by Jesus himself. And so they knew that if that's who they were, that they must also be doing it for others. That's what gave them their life and their hope. By 70 AD, as a, quote, Jewish Christian community, by 70 AD, the temple is destroyed by Rome. And now they found themselves as a community not only being bullied by the Roman Empire, and they were beginning to be bullied by the Roman Empire, but even their trusted brothers and sisters with whom they had sat in the synagogue and with whom they had gathered around the table, that they were also being bullied by them. Because now this heretical sect, according to the vision of Rome, was causing threats and instability to the Jewish community, who was struggling to survive, just like the followers of Jesus were struggling to survive. And it threw them back into turmoil, such that by the time that the Gospel of Luke comes to be written, scholars suggest somewhere between 75 and 85 AD, that they were in great torment. Great torment. So that now, 30, 40, you see, the closer you are to Jesus, the stronger the memory. Each generation, that unless it teaches that memory and practices the memory, that pretty soon, 2, 3 generations later, they begin to wonder, why should we believe anymore? What is it that we should believe in? When everything that we had hoped for seemed to be destroyed and was being destroyed by the big bully of Rome and by their own brothers and sisters. And so now listen again to that scripture, right? That when they talk about these things, and scholars suggest that by the time the gospel is written, even though it sounds like the temple is still standing, that the followers of Jesus only saw the smoldering ruins, if you will, of the temple in Jerusalem. That people barely were present in Jerusalem because they fled for their lives. And so when they hear these words, that is a very sharp memory in their life. We know what that is. We understand what that's about. And it hurts deeply, and they were in great pain and suffering. Because once again, not only were the core of their life taken from them, but everything that they had stuck their commitment to, the temple, if you will, also had been destroyed. And so now they found themselves as a community in the midst of being bullied by Rome and rejected by their own neighbors and friends, wondering where the hope would be for them. They had the memory, but that seemed to be fruitless and pointless. They still had their table fellowship. So it seemed as if they were on the verge of death itself. And that was the ending that this scripture is talking about. Not only death in terms of their own lives, because they were frightened for their lives, but also the death of their community, the potential death of their community. So what were they going to do at that point? I'd like to consider this analogy. The analogy has its pluses and minuses, has its positives and negatives, because it depends upon how well we are able to respond to not just the experience of death, but the way that things come to an end. And I think about it that my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and for a whole year she struggled with it. And I, at one point, even prayed, God, take the cancer from her and give it to me, because I was a young whippersnapper, strong, able-bodied 20-year-old, and said I could handle it better than my mother could handle it. And so your prayers are like that, and it didn't happen. And finally, we came to accept, my father and I, that she would die of her cancer. I was working out in Arizona, and so I still had lots of people around me, that community that can support you in times like that. My father didn't. He didn't have much friends. He didn't have a large social gathering. And sadly, and I think this is true, that he died of a broken heart 2 years later after my mother. That he just didn't see a future for himself. That he didn't see that there was any way to overcome the grief that he had experienced in his life. I think of it in terms of my grandmother. And my grandmother was one who had raised 4 kids, had made it through the Great Depression, had sent a son off to war, had seen her daughter go off to war, that my grandfather and grandmother had a good life. My grandfather was head red cap at Union Station in St. Louis. And one of the stories is that after Harry Truman became president, that my grandfather would get the word and he would go out into the train yard, and the train would stop out in the yard in order that Harry Truman could get off the train without having all the press and media around him. I don't know if that story is true, but that's how it was told in my family. And so I'd like to believe that my grandfather helped Harry Truman survive the press and the media. In 1954, I was 2 years old. My grandfather died of a sudden heart attack. At that point in my grandmother's life, she could have thought that it was the end. And I know some of you are in the same situation. She had never learned to drive. She always depended upon her husband. And yet, what she was able to do is not only to look at her sons and daughters, and now her grandchildren, such that she moved in with my mom and dad, and she raised me. And I tell that part of the story because my father, in a sense, couldn't deal with that great ending in his life. My grandmother could. And I know many of you that at the point that you lost your spouses, it could have been over. Ask yourself why there aren't a whole lot of men who survived the death of their spouses compared to women. It's because we men don't build that social network that women often have. And so the future for us when we come to the experience of death doesn't provide. There are a few of you here, thank God, a few of you who have survived the death and loss of your spouses. But there's even fewer that do. The reason why I use that analogy is because I think that's where the Christian community was. It could have either accepted death at that point, and that would have been it. In other words, that the pain and the suffering that they were experiencing, the loss that they were going through, could have been something so overwhelming for them that they would have just stopped being a community altogether. And the fellowship at the table would have been broken permanently. But remember what I said at the beginning, that the first thing that they had were the relationships in their community, in their family. Even though some of their brothers and sisters were rejecting them and didn't want to have anything to do with them, that they had their community to rely upon. And they had the fellowship of the table. And at that fellowship of the table, they had the memory of Jesus. And every time that they remembered Jesus, and you'll hear me use those words, every time that they ate of the bread and drank of the cup, they remembered Jesus in such a powerful way that it enabled them not just to survive, not just to persevere, but to thrive in the face of the suffering and the pain that they experienced. It enabled them to recommit themselves to being not only disciples of Jesus who had lived in their past, but to being disciples, as it says, give testimony today for who you are because of who Jesus was, but give testimony today because of who you are as a result of believing in Jesus. And celebrate that. Even, it's almost like, this may sound terrible, but it's like, spit in their face and celebrate who you are. Because it is that needs to be known and needs to be seen. In a sense, my grandmother spit in the face of death because she had a lot of life to live. And let me tell you, she needed every bit of it to help raise me. That's the point. That's what Jesus is saying. They shall not hurt you or destroy you. By your endurance, you will gain. And while I take umbrage at the one line, not a hair on your head will perish. I don't know. But you see, that's the invitation. We survive, but not just survive. That's not good enough. We don't just persevere to put up with the garbage that we have to put up with. But we thrive because we have relationships, because we share the table with each other, and because we have the example of Jesus, who touched, lifted up, made whole, forgave, and continued to remind people that God's love was so huge that every single one, even their enemies, would be loved by God.